Hello, welcome to Classical Theology. We're going to discuss philosophy tonight and what that is, how that relates to Christianity and theology and apologetics in the Bible and all that. My last class, ironically, in college at Lee University was in philosophy. It was in the summer I graduated in 2004. And in that fall, I started taking classes at Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I learned that if you're going to be able to do apologetics, and if you're going to do theology and even read the Bible and talk about the interpretation of the Bible, you're going to have to learn philosophy. I didn't know that. That was a shocker to me when I started SES. SES is known for its philosophical underpinnings of moderate realism that goes back to Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and Norm Geisler is the person who really helped found the school with Ross Rhodes. And that was what they taught. And between Norm Geisler and Tom Howe and Jason Reed and others, I quickly learned my first semester that I am not going to be worth a hill of beans in the world of apologetics or theology or anything like that if I don't have some knowledge of philosophy. So what is that? Well, we're going to go over tonight what philosophy is and how it relates to all these different things. So let's just dive in. This is a presentation that I really get into even with my students. It's a broad overview, so we're going to look at it. And if you have any questions, comments, or just anything you want to say, please do so in the comment section here. Love to get to talk to you and answer any questions and address anything you want to talk about. So with that said, what is philosophy? Well, there are many basic questions that philosophy and philosophers want to ask and hopefully answer even, maybe. One of those is, what does it mean to be real? Now, I learned this is called metaphysics, and some call this ontology, not to be confused with oncology. Ontology comes from the Greek word ontos, for being, and it's similar to the ontological argument. We're going to look at that later, actually. So my first year wedding anniversary, actually, I was in a module. Don't ever do this. I was in a module on metaphysics. Didn't know what that was, but I was told you have to take this class because it's that important. I didn't have to for my program, but they said, you've got to take this. I think Doug Potter taught me into taking this. He's one of our professors as well and runs our demon program. Hey, Doug, if you're out there. So I took it and I came back and my wife said, well, what is the class about? And I said, I don't know. It's about, is the table really there, and what is being and what is existence and all this kind of stuff. It took me a while. Don't ever take metaphysics as a module. Don't ever do that. And that's the worst thing you ever do. And it's never been offered that way again at SES since January 2005. So I ended up auditing it later to take it and kind of figure out better, what is this thing even about? But let me not get too far into this. So what is real tries to get, this is what I ask my students is, who has a dog? I ask them who has a dog, and I'll say, okay, well, what kind of dog do you have? And hopefully they have a beagle. Because what I want to do is say, okay, what's the difference between your beagle and Snoopy? That's metaphysics. What does it mean to exist? Does your beagle really exist? Does Snoopy really exist? And so we're trying to get out what is the nature, and hopefully we'll get some debate there about, well, does Snoopy, so some people will say he does, and some people say he doesn't exist. So what do you think? Do you think Snoopy exists? Well, philosophers will be divided on that, and among everything else as well. But metaphysics is a paramount importance and foundational importance to philosophy in general, to theology and everything else. We're going to see that as we go along. But metaphysics in general is the study of what it means to exist, what is ultimate reality like, what does human nature like, how do we differ from God in that regard, and what is change. We're going to get into some of this tonight. But there are other things as well. So, and the other category question is, what is knowledge? This is epistemology from the Greek word episteme, meaning knowledge. So what is knowledge? What does it mean to know something? How does the knowing process happen? So these are, in fact, we have classes on these, actually all these questions on here, except for maybe one. They're so important. We have a class on all this stuff at SES. Another question is, what is good? What is ethics? So far, we have a class on all of these topics that we do in SES in our philosophy programs. What does it mean to be good? Aesthetics. I actually taught ethics and aesthetics at the Art Institute of Charlotte for 3 years. hired me to be their philosopher there, and I taught ethics and aesthetics there. It's very interesting. Subcategory of philosophy is what does it mean to be beautiful? What counts as art? Those kind of things are what you think about in aesthetics. What is the right way to think? Logic. So we teach this. I teach this now for Apologia online classes, and so we look and teach people because my wife and I were lamenting tonight that schools want students to be able to read, to be able to think, and to be able to memorize, and they don't really teach them how to do any of that beyond just elementary reading. It wasn't until grad school that I took a class at SES on logic. And let me tell you, it was probably the most life-changing class I've ever had. And one of my professors, Tom Howe, says that when he took it, the scales fell from his eyes. So logic, because you can't be a scholar or an expert in everything, but you can be a good logician. You can think, and thinking well will help you not just with school, but with your job and communication and everything else as well. We got Scott Terry here saying presuppositionalism for the win. We are going to discuss that later tonight. So hold on. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, he says it's against the interest of government school to teach children how to actually think and to think logically. I actually have heard that as a theory for why they took logic out of schools, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's true. It's sad, but it's true. So if you get it, no matter what you think about philosophy, if you get a chance to take logic, take logic. Take logic. It'll help you. You can thank me later. There are lots of subfields in philosophy. There's a philosophy of no matter what. Philosophy of history. In fact, I wrote my master's thesis on this. What is the nature of history? Can historians be objective? You know, what counts? How do historians do history? Philosophy of science. What counts as science? My area is philosophy of religion, which deals primarily with, does God exist? What is God like? Does he change? Is he in time? Do we affect him? What about religious? I can't say the word. Religious experience. All right. Here's an interesting comment here from one that says, I feel it's like it's the church to teach the children to not think logically. Did I read that right? Did I misread that? It says, I feel like it's the church to teach children. I'm not sure if you think things are their church is done to teach children or not teach them, but regardless, I think the church should teach that too. In fact, I have a great book here I'm going to be using in one of my classes starting Monday on that. And shout out to Ken Samples. He's a great guy, friend of mine. Clear thinking in a messy world, and he makes the same argument that I'm going to take you as making. I'm not sure if you were or not, but that the church should also have a role in promoting logical thinking as well. So lots of subfields of philosophy. Appreciate all the comments here, yeah. But how does philosophy and theology relate to each other? All right. So the literal meaning of the word philosophy is love of wisdom. So we get the philos or philophilos meaning love and Sophia meaning wisdom. So love of wisdom. And this is based in something we'll see tonight regarding general revelation versus special revelation. General revelation is what we can know just from nature or creation. And theology, the study of God, theos from God, the Greek word for God, and ology or logia, which is giving an account of or studying something, like got sociology, psychology, and whatever else. Theology is based both in general, and I should say special revelation. Revelation, there's really two books, as it were, general and special revelation. It's general in the areas of philosophical theology or natural theology, systematic theology, historical. It's special when it comes to primarily biblical. When we look at what the Bible says specifically on something, like, for example, the Trinity and the Incarnation, those would be, and the Atonement, would be something we get primarily from the Bible. So we're not going to get a real direct knowledge of the Trinity simply from creation. At least that's what many people would say, and I would agree with that. Okay. Other areas of theology, theology proper, studying about God, his existence and attributes, hamartiology, the study of sin, soteriology, the study of salvation, ecclesiology, study of the church, eschatology, study of last things. So there's all kinds of areas and subfields of theology as well. But what is philosophy really? It's the study of reality through reason. Well, doesn't everything do that? Doesn't biology do that? Doesn't history do that? Yes. But the difference between, say, philosophy and biology is that philosophy, especially when it comes to metaphysics, wants to study the nature of things as such in general, with no real limitation on. So biology studies things as far as they're living. So again, from everything's Greek, all right. So bios from living, biology, the study of living things. We look back at epistemology. On metaphysics. We want to look at the nature of being as such, or existence as such, not in terms of a certain category like biology or physics or history or anything like that, but just existence in general. So philosophy is very general when it comes to that. It's universal, regardless of where you live, your culture, religion, your politics, your economics, whatever. There are people in the East doing it, people in the West doing it, and they might not know it or realize it. That's why we're making this kind of explicit in our talk tonight. But everyone does it because it's so broad. And one of my, I guess, goals in teaching this on this channel and in my classes is because when people say that Christians can't do philosophy, or we shouldn't do it as if it's pagan or something, I would argue that we probably are not using the word in the same way. And so if you have an objection, we're going to look at some objections to philosophy here in a little bit. But if you have an objection to philosophy, we're probably using the word in a different way, or at least sometimes. So it undergirds all things, because whether you're reading a book, whether you are doing math or physics or history or whatever, you've got to have some belief or some at least implicit understanding of what you're doing, and that something's there to be doing it. If you're just crocheting something, you think there's something there. Even if you're an idealist, which says there's nothing materially there, you have some view of what reality is, you're doing some kind of philosophy. And so everyone does it. And I'm not saying everyone's a philosopher as such or a professional in that way, but we all do philosophy. Like we all do history to some degree. We all do biology to some degree. We all do psychology. But it's not always refined or intentional. And so what I'm trying to say is that Christians should be more intentional and see how philosophy influences their theology, their apologetics, their Bible reading, and everything else, which is why we're here. So thanks for being here. All right. Yep, exactly. So this is what I was going to get to later. It says C.S. Lewis says that good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Excellent. Very good. We're going to get that later as well. And philosophy can help decide between competing ideas via or by way of first principles. And so every discipline has first principles. And so in philosophy and logic, first principles are going to be these. They're going to be, well, we'll get that in a minute, I guess. I got a little ahead of myself there. I thought my next slide was here. But Stephen Hawking says this, and we're going to look at this as well. So in his page 1 of his book, The Grand Design, it says, how can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Traditionally, these are the questions for philosophy, and that's true. But he says philosophy is dead. I wouldn't agree with that. But he says that, and he's from Cambridge. And so I doubt that the philosophers at Cambridge would probably agree with that. They probably would not agree with that at all. All right. Objections to philosophy. I guess we're going to get to the first principles here a little bit later. One objection that is common is that faith is opposed to philosophy and reason. So if you ask somebody today, what is faith? All right. Many people today would say believing something in spite of the evidence or believing something against the evidence. Historically, faith is trusting a reliable source. Okay. But many will point here to Paul in Colossians 2:8, which says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy, and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." So does that mean we shouldn't do philosophy? No, I don't think Paul is saying here not to do philosophy. He's saying not to be taken captive by philosophy and empty deceit. And I would agree. We should not be captive by philosophy, bad philosophy, or empty deceit. Some commentators believe here he has a specific philosophy in mind, possibly Gnosticism. And also, Paul, more than calling out bad philosophy, he calls out bad theology. So does that mean that we shouldn't do theology? Well, of course not. Paul wouldn't say that. But it does say more times than one here than philosophy that we shouldn't be tripped up and taken captive really by bad theology either. Another objection is that sin has destroyed the ability to reason. People will say that. Of course, if that were true, we wouldn't be able to even know that because people reason. And if sin has destroyed the ability to reason, we wouldn't be able to reason that conclusion. Now, people might say that's just Christians who can understand that, but we do know that even non-believers have reason as well. They're still human. They are rational animals. They have the intellect that God has given them. We just don't have it the way that we should have it. But we all are rational creatures. All right, first principles. Here we go. There are at least three. Here are some of the three. Some add a fourth to this regarding logic and being. And these are very fundamental, and they're going to sound probably pedantic and elementary, but we use it every day without even thinking about it. One is the law of non-contradiction, which says that just A is not A. So you can't have something can't be termed not A and A at the same time. It can't be A and not A. So if I have to take this book here, I can't say this is a book and it's also not a book at the same time in the same. So that would violate the law of non-contradiction. Okay, that's easy enough. The law of excluded middle says either it's A or non-A. Either it's a book or it's not a book. There's no middle ground, hence the term excluded middle. We have the law of identity. A is A. If it's a book, it's a book. And some will add the law of valid inference as well. Now, as we're doing philosophy, we're going to make arguments, right? Now, the next two slides, I tell my students, these are the most important slides we're going to cover probably in this topic, and sometimes even in the classes. Because if you can, and this is not a logic talk, I know that, but we're kind of getting toward what philosophy is, and we're going to be making arguments. So whether we're doing theology or philosophy, you want to use logic. Well, here's kind of how logic works. We want to persuade people. We want to demonstrate to people, not just assert things. Here's one thing I try to tell my students and my children and everything else if we're trying to prove something and think, well, is that, yeah, well, I can assert something, but if I want you to agree with me, I want to demonstrate it. I want to persuade you, okay? Well, a great way of doing that is through an argument. Now, it doesn't mean we're arguing like children. Maybe you've seen the argument clinic with John Cleese, which is hilarious. But an argument like this where we've got premises that lead to a conclusion. So all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a basic argument. And it has different aspects to it. I'm just going to go over real quickly so you can kind of see what's going on here. One is truth. Now, I ask my students, so what does it mean for a statement to be true? If I say all men are mortal, what makes that true or not? And they'll say, hopefully, well, if all men actually are mortal, right? So I'm wearing a green shirt. Is that statement true or false? Well, it's true if I'm wearing a green shirt, right? So the statements individually can be true or false, and the argument as a whole can be valid or invalid, meaning that the conclusion follows necessarily. So if I say everybody watching me talk right now is from Mars, let's pick on somebody. Scott is watching me talk right now, therefore Scott is from Mars. Well, that'll apply to everybody, not to pick on Scott too much. Is that valid? Yes, because the conclusion would follow from the premises. Doesn't make it true, because I doubt that Scott's at Mars, on Mars. Yeah, I'll get my prepositions right here. But it's valid, meaning that the conclusion just follows necessarily. And if you've got both truth and validity, the argument is said to be sound. And take another argument like this: if it is raining, therefore the driveway is wet. It is raining, therefore the driveway is wet. My point here with this argument to teach people is this tells us about necessary and sufficient conditions. Okay. A condition is necessary, and people confuse this all the time, if something has to be the case but doesn't guarantee something else. Something is sufficient if when you have it, it does guarantee something else. So, for example, if I say that there's oxygen in this room and there's fire in the room, one is sufficient for the other and one is necessary for the other. So oxygen is necessary for fire, but thank God it's not sufficient because that would guarantee it. So if I say fire is in the room, that would be sufficient for oxygen. So I tell my students, if you want to get an A in the class, it's necessary to take the midterm. But taking the midterm is only necessary. It's not going to guarantee you an A. But if you get an A, that guarantees you took the midterm. So it's a sufficient condition. All right. Just trying to get you some philosophical terms and some categories to think about this. Let's see here. One of my students here actually says we should remember the earlier verses of Colossians 2:3, in whom Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Thanks for being here, and thanks for the comment there. Very good. Excellent. So why do I have a channel that talks about mainly about classical theology, but you're going to have to use philosophy to undergird that? So why do I talk about that? Why so much emphasis? Why do I have philosophy programs at a seminary, for example? Why philosophy in the Bible college or at Apologetic, where we give homeschoolers classes, or why all this? Well, one, because as we're going to argue, it's unavoidable and necessary. Many people want to say they can do things without philosophy, such as science, history, biblical interpretation, whatever, natural theology, apologetics, without doing philosophy. I'm going to argue that's not possible. Because as we saw before, the categories of philosophy include existence and knowledge. Well, you can't really do science, history, biblical interpretation without having some belief about the nature of existence and how knowledge is communicated. All right, I'm going to demonstrate this here in a second on biblical interpretation. All right. I have a comment here. I'm going to ask you why you think this. I don't think, Anthony says, philosophy belongs in religion. Let me ask you a question as we're going along. Can you define what you think philosophy is? This is where I was thinking I'm going to say that we're probably not using it in the same way. Maybe we are, I doubt it. So, Anthony, how do you define philosophy? He says you don't think it belongs in religion. And this is why we're talking about this tonight, because I think it's important. And then Monty Sarlacc, if I'm saying that right, says it doesn't belong to everyone, whether you are a theist or not. Right? Not quite sure what you mean there. If you mean not everyone does it, or you mean clarify that for me a little bit, because I'm not sure how I can take that one way or a different way. But I'm going to argue that we're all going to do philosophy, either badly or well. And as someone earlier up in the comments said, as some like C.S. Lewis said, we're going to do philosophy because bad philosophy is there. And we're either going to do it well or we're going to do it badly on purpose. We're going to do it well on purpose or badly by accident. Hope we're not doing it badly on purpose. Or well, maybe we can do it well on accident, maybe perhaps, but not very often. So it is how God created us as well. We are rational creatures. God gave us a mind. He gave us an intellect, and he wants us to use it. And being philosophical is really just being able to think about God's creation with the mind and the intellect that he gave us. In fact, I argue that using philosophy to think about God is worship, because when I'm in here, this is not just my studio, it's my office. I call it my studio office, studio. What I have a name for it, a studio or studioffice, whatever I call it. I've got places where I sit and read and think and write and all that kind of stuff. Well, when I'm doing that about theology, I think when we're pondering about God, we have classes about God, and we're stripping away what we really think really is limitations on God and what's false. We're pondering what God is, and we're thinking about him and saying, no, it's not that, he's not that, he's this, he's this. Thinking about God rightly and trying to understand him, to me, in my view, is worship. In fact, some of the most worshipful times for me have been when I'm thinking about God and I feel like I'm concentrating on him and I'm trying to understand him. Whether I'm reading the Bible, whether I'm doing philosophy straight away or theology, I think that that to me is a way of doing worship. Okay. Let's see here, Scott. I'm gonna let you. Let's see, I got a response here from Anthony again, and he's gonna say, "To me, you start to philosophize when you go beyond the text." Okay. All right. I'm going to show you actually. I think it's an interesting comment. We're going to go to some ways of how I think philosophy is done while we're interpreting the text. Thanks for the comment. I appreciate that. Scott says here, if you love Christ and think Christ was the living manifestation of truth, then seeking him out is a holy act. I agree. I agree with that. All right. Monty Sherlock says it belongs to everyone. Okay. Thanks for the clarification there. All right. Scott says, I'm trying to see how many books on the Ultra Huffling's shelves I can recognize. Yeah, I have a little bit of a blurry effect going on. I could take that off. I've got a bunch up there that maybe you can pick out there. All right. So let's keep on trucking. I appreciate the comments, though. Thank you very much. I love it. Since I'm glad that Anthony brought this up, because we're going to look at that now. His question about the role of the interpreter going beyond the text and all that. And what I'm going to argue, what I've argued for years, is that we really can't even do biblical interpretation or reading anything, whether it's this book on logic or the Bible or Garfield or anything, without having some underlying philosophical categories and beliefs. All right. So when we read the Bible, and we pride ourselves at SES for believing that, and we're in the minority of people here. In fact, if I can... unscripted moment here. One of our professors, Tom Howe, has written this book called Objectivity in Biblical Interpretation. Give my hand out of the way. Thomas Howe. One of my professors, wonderful professor. You can see his picture here. This is a great book, Objectivity in Biblical Interpretation. In fact, Walter Kaiser said he wished he wrote this book because not many people believe that you can have an objective view of the meaning of the biblical text. Well, we do at SES, and Tom does, and I do. And the question is first of all, where is meaning? If we're going to try to have an objective view of the meaning, we have to ask, well, where is the meaning? And this is going to be a philosophical question because we're looking at the nature of meaning and the nature of communication and the nature of interpretation. So there are at least three places where meaning could reside. One is in the author's intention. This is where a lot of people will say that the meaning resides, that the author has a meaning he wants to communicate to you as the reader, and your job as the reader is to discover the intention of the author. Now, there is meaning there, but the problem with that is if it's solely in the author's intention, we don't have access to intentions unless the author just gives us that intention. But even if you have to push that even more and say, well, then the intention of that is in his mind, then you have an infinite regress problem. Okay, so we have one view of where meaning is in the author's intention. Another is in the text. So when I grab my Bible and I'm reading it, whether it's on Logos, read there on the computer a lot, or my physical Bible, and I'm just reading it, there's words there, and some will say the meaning is in the text. Okay? And another way of looking at it is to say the meaning is in the reader. Okay, so we've got three different options here. We've got one saying the meaning is in the author, one saying the meaning is in the text, and the other is saying the meaning is in the reader. And the reader responds to and provides that meaning, and that makes it very subjective. Well, I argue that meaning is of course it's in the intention as well because the author is putting it in the text. But I think it's also in the text itself, that the meaning is actually in the text. And that's all we have access to, really, unless we're talking to the author himself and getting it from the author. But there are lots of interpretive frameworks that people talk about in books on how to read the Bible, and they're overall good books. So here are some that we have used. I've used as a student because, yeah, I got a degree or 2 degrees in philosophy from SES, but I also have a degree in biblical studies. And I took advanced hermeneutics, philosophy of hermeneutics, and we used these books. And they're good books. In fact, when I taught this material in school, I would use these books. They are, in general, good books. But they do contain chapters on philosophy, and it's those chapters where I think they have some problems. Okay. What are those problems? Well, let's look at them. In this book, The Hermeneutical Spiral, which again is a good book by Grant Osborne, he says this, and he's going to argue for what's called a sociology of knowledge. All right. Basically, sociology of knowledge states that no act of coming to understanding can escape the formative power of the background and the paradigm community to which an interpreter belongs. What he's arguing here, what sociology of knowledge is that your way of being brought up, your formative years in your culture and your society is not only affecting what you know, but how you know. That is that the very epistemological, there's that word again, way that you come to know things and that you form knowledge itself is affected by your culture and your environment. He goes on to say this, a close reading of the text cannot be done without a perspective provided by one's pre-understanding as identified by a sociology of knowledge perspective. We say it again, a close reading of the text cannot be done without a perspective provided by your pre-understanding. So you can't know what the text says unless you bring all the stuff with you in your pre-understanding before you get to the text. Okay. Reflection itself demands mental categories. I agree with that. And these are built on one's presupposed worldview. Now we come into a problem because how do you form a worldview unless you already have one already built for you, and by the faith or reading community to which one belongs. Since neutral exegesis, understanding what the text means, that's what exegesis means, drawing out the meaning. Since neutral exegesis is, what he says, impossible, no necessarily true or final interpretation is possible. Now, this is an evangelical scholar who has written an evangelical book on how to interpret the Bible. And he says that because you can't be neutral in how you interpret the text, it's impossible to have a true or final interpretation of the text. Now, I would argue that there's a lot of problems with that. One is that he thinks that we can read his book objectively and then we're not going to change it. In fact, this happened when Bart Ehrman, who was a well-known scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, came to talk to us. He actually debated Michael Licona on the resurrection, and I think it was resurrection, may have been the gospel, quote-unquote, accounts, contradiction or whatever. And he says in the last page of his book, Misquoting Jesus, Ehrman says that by virtue of reading a book, you insert yourself on it and you necessarily change it. And Tom Howe says, well, if I read your book, then how am I not going to change it? And people started to realize that was a very self-defeating thing that Ehrman was saying. And Ehrman's response was he said, email me. He realized he was caught. He didn't want to go forward anymore in the conversation. He says, email me so we can have a private conversation. And Tom says, well, I've got to read your email. So how am I going to get beyond? Oh, you saw that debate, Scott? Yeah. Yeah, that was a number of years ago, but that was an interesting one. So I think that's very problematic by what Osborne is saying here. Now let's go to a different book, which is, again, a good book. And I think Osborne's book is good insofar as it tells us how to interpret, not the philosophy stuff in the back. But the Introduction to Biblical Interpretation, which I like in general, they say this, the authors of that book say this: no one interprets anything without a set of underlying assumptions. When we presume to explain the meaning of the Bible, we do so with a set of preconceived ideas or presuppositions. these presuppositions may be examined and stated or simply embraced unconsciously, but anyone who says that he or she has discarded all presuppositions and will study the text objectively and inductively is either deceived or naive. So I took this kind of thinking and what Tom did in his book and applied it to history. In fact, I wanted to write on just New Testament reliability, and one of my thesis leaders, Norm Geiser, said, well, we really need some more work on philosophy of history and can historians be objective. And a fun fact, William Lane Craig did his very thesis on that, actually, and I drew on that for some of my stuff. But one thing I've noticed in my research on the objectivity and bias discussion is that people don't normally define what they mean by bias and neutral and objective and all that kind of stuff. So we need to be clear on what we mean with that. And I don't think that they're being very clear here in this section as to what they think presuppositions are really, or objectivity and all that kind of stuff. But they go on and say, indeed, interpretation depends not only upon the methods and qualifications of interpreters, but also upon their presuppositions. Thus, the development of an approach to hermeneutics involves two components. One, an essential set of presuppositions that constitutes its starting point. And two, a deliberate strategy involving methods and procedures that will determine viable interpretations and assess competing alternatives. Such a strategy will also require some means of verifying that the preferred interpretation is superior to its alternatives. And they finish by saying, this is why we present here the assumptions or presuppositions that we believe are necessary for an accurate interpretation of the Bible. Not all interpreters or readers will align themselves with this position, though we hope that many do and others will be persuaded to. And finally, they say regarding pre-understandings, the pre-understanding and presuppositions of the interpreter, now listen to this, contribute enormously to the results of the interpretive process. We might even say they determine the results. We may even say that they determine, our pre-understandings determine the result. Well, you can't be objective if by that you mean coming at a true universal understanding. If our pre-understandings necessarily not just contribute, but determine the meaning of the text. Patty, good to see you. Here's one of my fellow teachers at Apologetic. She says, if the interpretation is impossible, then how can we truly or not exhaustively know God? If true interpretation is impossible, how can we truly know God? Or even the meaning of that text. That's true. Very good point. Very good point. So this, though, is how philosophy relates to biblical interpretation. It is that we have to look at where does meaning lie. Where is it found? Is it in the author's intention, the text, the reader? How do we view bias? How do we view the nature of objectivity, the nature of communication? So a lot of the philosophy of language, we're not getting that right now, but a lot of the philosophy of language is implicit and explicit in the issue of biblical interpretation. So I'm trying to pick out some of my books. My biblical interpretation philosophy stuff is over here. And so what they're going to argue is that when we're using language, then it has a necessarily philosophical aspect to it, because you're trying to figure out the nature of meaning, the nature of knowledge, and how to communicate. All right. Anthony says, is this why tradition is so important? In some regards, but I think we should acknowledge that we are to some extent going to do philosophy and theology as well. So curious as to what you mean by tradition. When I hear that, I think Catholic, but maybe you don't mean that. And the reason I wondered is because the Catholic tradition imbibes a lot of philosophy. So I'm just wondering if you meant that, or a different kind of tradition, maybe. But there are lots of traditions out there. It can be Reformed tradition, it can be Scholastic, it can be all kind of things. And yes, you're right, Scott. I am going to employ what he says, a Thomistic realist epistemology. There you go. Ding, ding, ding. Good job. I think this is the right button. Nope. Nope. I got it somewhere. Maybe not. There we go. All right. That's it. Good job. Gotta learn my buttons better. All right. So, with all that said, philosophy relates to also many apologetic issues, such as the existence of God. This is a big debate, and it's a debate that I think is interesting and important. And so lots of people are arguing about whether or not we can demonstrate God exists from reason alone. And I'm going to argue that we can't. That's not my point. But my argument here is that philosophy plays a part in that. Also, the nature of God and the coherence of theism. Does God, we're going to get to this later, but what's God like? I'm not going to get too much ahead of myself. What's God like? How does he relate to time and change and us? All these things about God. Is he made up of parts? Is he simple? All these kind of things. The problem of evil. We're going to look at all this here in just a few minutes. The nature of miracles. And the nature and method of apologetics. So I've seen in the chat here or the comments some references to presuppositionalism and that kind of thing. And there are different methods to apologetics. And I'm not going to go over all these in much depth here. I'll have another maybe session on that later. One is classical, and that's basically a two-step method where you first show that theism is true, and then show that Christianity is true by looking at the biblical reliability, prophecy, historical arguments, the resurrection, and all that. The evidential model, which skips just to the evidences, and they might think that, as Michael Icona does, and I think Gary Habermas shows or believes, that if you show the Bible is true and the resurrection happened, that just brings along with it belief in theism. All right. Some people will make a different category for just historical apologetics, where you look at not just prophecy, but look at historical reliability and that kind of thing, the resurrection and all that, the reliability of the Gospels and that. And then the most antithetical to the classical model is the presuppositional model. And we'll have I have a whole video on this, actually, if you want to watch it, on apologetic methods. But the presuppositional model is very different, and it's going to be the one that says that we cannot use reason alone, what they will call autonomous human reason, that reason is necessarily sinful because it relies solely on man and not on God's grace. I would disagree that it doesn't rely on God's grace, because everything that we do as humans relies on God giving us grace, giving us existence. And I recently realized, it kind of dawned on me one night, well, why is reason sinful and why is reason autonomous, but the senses aren't? Because even non-Christians use their senses to read, to see things, to hear and smell and touch and taste. Why are those things not seen as autonomous and sinful? Why is it mainly, and I guess they are, at least sinful, because I don't know if just using your senses is sinful, but that raises the question to me as well, if by virtue of reasoning and using our senses are sinful, that's how God made us. So that would be being sinful by just by virtue of how God made us, which I don't think that would make a lot of sense. Anthony here is saying, by tradition, I mean interpretations or practices that have been passed down. Yeah. I come from, Islam. Okay. And we have teachers that have lists of teachers all the way back to the source. Yes. And there's a tradition. So when I teach medieval philosophy, I teach Islamic philosophy as well. And I realize that they're not really going to be giving you a orthodox position on Islam. My understanding is that these guys like Avicenna and Averroes are more in the Sufi tradition. Not sure what you're in, Anthony. But yeah, we're going to look. Tradition is very important. My point here with all this is that we need to recognize the role of reason in all that we do, and that we're not going to be able to avoid philosophy. But thanks for the comments. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right. So I said that philosophy relates to God in different ways, and we're coming to a close here. I can take some questions at the end if you want as well. But theistic proofs, classical theism, and the problem of evil. Theistic proofs are simply ways that we try to prove that God exists. And that'll come from, speaking of tradition, Anthony, it comes from the Aristotelian tradition, the Platonic tradition. There are some in Islamic tradition. So, for example, Wheelman and Craig, his main argument, the Kalam, really goes back to the Islamic tradition and comes out of that school of thought. I think it's a good argument. It's a different kind of argument than what I normally use. I use it because it's simple and straightforward, but I don't think it gives us all the bang for the buck that we could use if we use a more philosophical type proof. It does make a philosophical move, but theistic proofs are going to ask questions about God's existence and try to demonstrate that. Here's one that is one of the quote-unquote more philosophical, that tries to use just reason alone and trying to be a priori as opposed to a posteriori, meaning that it tries not to, I think it's impossible, but tries not to rely on our experience. I don't think you can do that. But here's what it tries. This is from Anselm, 11th century monk. He says, God is a being that which none greater can be conceived. It is better to exist in reality than just in the mind. Therefore, God must exist in reality. So this argument, called the ontological argument, has been making the rounds on social media last at least few days, maybe weeks, because there's been a resurgence of it. Bill Craig, I'm not sure when he said this, but I saw the video the other day saying that Craig thinks there's more to this argument than many give it credit for. In fact, Alvin Plantinga has revamped it in his modal proof that uses this kind of thinking. All right. Scott here says, let's see if I can read this. The more text, the smaller it is for me to see. If Christ says that P, it does seem sinful, at least a theological faux pas, to think P needs some independent verification. Yeah, I'm not trying to say that per se. All I'm trying to say is that when we have experience of reality, we have some kind of implicit metaphysical and epistemological views that we really can't get away from. Of course, and the saying goes, if Christ says that we should believe it, and that's true. I'm not trying to detract from that at all. I don't disagree with that. I'm trying to make a broader statement than that. But this is an example of a theistic proof. There's lots of them. We have more of this on my channel. I'm going to have more stuff on my channel on these kind of things. What is classical theism? My last video was on this very topic. Teaching the course, we're done now. I'm grading everything on this topic. What is classical theism? Classical theism is a view, a tradition. It's historical. I think it's the traditional view. That's why it's called the classical view. That God doesn't change. God does know everything. But these questions arise, and philosophy will help adjudicate these questions. Let me go back to that. Does God change? Well, what would that mean? What would God have to be like if he did change? Does God know everything? Well, we could ask, what does it mean for God to know? Because as physical beings who are limited and know things passively, so if you looked at this book, you can hear me hitting it, you can see it, you can read it, you know all those things passively. The question is, does God know things passively? Like we do? Well, he's not even a material being, if you take a classical view. So then, what does it mean for God to know anything? This is a theological / philosophical way of looking at these questions. All right. Yes, Scott's right. There's a lot going on in the literature and on the social media about the ontological argument. And it's very interesting. So what does it mean for God to know everything? What does it mean for God to know it all? Does what God knows change? So one of the arguments that Bill Craig makes, and that's my doctoral dissertation on this, is if God knows what we're doing and we're changing, then does God's knowledge change? Because does God's knowledge track what we're doing from one moment to the next? And if so, is his knowledge changing? Well, it would be temporal if that were the case, and it would have to be somewhat passive as well. Yeah, the Clear Thinking book does have a cool cover, and it's a good book. You should check it out. So all these questions in classical theism are at least somewhat philosophical in nature. And then something I never really meant to get into is this is about the problem of evil. Is God all good and all knowing? If he is all-knowing, then he knows what it's like to lust. Here's what one philosopher has said back in 2019 in the New York Times. If he knows what it's like to lust, then he is not all good. And so, let me go back. I went too far. And so, either God's not all-knowing or is not all good. So we're going to have to use philosophical and theological categories to adjudicate that kind of argument. And my response to it would be, well, God knows what it's like for us to lust, but God cannot lust because lusting actually is a deficiency that only deficient beings can experience. And he doesn't know things passively like us, so he knows what it's like for a human to lust without having to experience it. So this argument assumes that God has to experience something in order to know it. A great question here. So does God use justified true belief, or is that passive knowledge? I would argue it's passive. Although you will hear theologians and others, people talking about God having the same kind of framework of epistemology that we do, that God has justified true belief. That means that if you have good reasons for believing in something, it is true, and you do believe it, then it's said to be knowledge. Now, there's a lot of questions about this with Gettier, 1963, and the decades since then. It's gotten all out of sorts, really. But that would, if you think God has justified true belief, the tripartite view of knowledge, or JTB, you would have to ask several questions. Well, what would it mean for God to be justified? Of course, people normally define omniscience as God having knowledge of all true propositions. But it raises another question: is can God believe something? So what's the nature? Let's go back to epistemology. What does it mean to believe something? And is knowledge, are our knowledge and belief the same, or are they different? So I don't think God has beliefs in this regard, and I don't think that God would have JTB, but I don't even define knowledge as JTB for humans. I think Gettier shows that we can have, well, first of all, I don't define knowledge in that kind of analytic way. It's more of an experience between the intellect, the senses, and the object. All right. But those are great questions, and that, yeah, I think that would be a problem for God if he had justified true belief, but that's how many people, or at least some people, will define it. So that's how I would tackle this argument here. This is Peter Adderton. I have an article on this on my blog on brianhelfing.com. And then my last point before I get to any other questions is the problem of evil, something I never really wanted to get into because everybody in my field of philosophy of religion deals with the problem of evil. I didn't want to do it because everyone else did it. And I also didn't want to debate a new atheist. And in 2019, if you're watching Adam Tucker from SES, who did our events, asked me to debate Michael Shermer, a new atheist, on the problem of evil. So I did it. I'm glad I did it. Lots of cool things came about it, including, do I have it near me? A book. Here it is. If I can reach it. A book that Michael and I and Gary Wittenberger did on this topic. Has really cool chapters also by James Sturba and Richard Howe on God, evil, and morality. A debate was based basically on our informal discussion at SES. That kind of bloomed into some articles in Michael Shermer's magazine called Skeptic and all that kind of stuff. But my point is that I ended up inadvertently getting into all this. I didn't really want to. I'm glad I did, though, because it really brought a lot of stuff to my my career, me personally. I got to know people like Michael and Jim Storber, who's a friend of mine now, and we publish a lot together and have debates and that kind of thing. But this kind of argument about God being all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful, but then why does evil exist? Then God shouldn't be able to exist if that's the case. These are philosophical in nature. Okay. All right. I'm going to post this for Adam in case Adam sees this later. I'll tell him to watch that. Adam Tucker is pretty cool. Met him a few times. Yes, he is a pretty cool guy. Love Adam. He's a good friend of mine, close friend of mine. In fact, I talked to him just before the live stream. He called me and said, hey, have you got a minute? We talked for a minute. So shout out to you, Adam. You are pretty cool. Thanks for being such a great guy. So that's what philosophy is. This is a really quick run through of what philosophy is, how it relates to theology and apologetics and biblical studies, and it relates to everything. But I do want to see if there are any other questions. I want to go about an hour, and that's about where we are right now. Thank you for the comments. I appreciate that because I wanted to be able to have comments and have people watching here live and be able to share them. But if you have any other questions, now is the time. If you're watching this in the recorded format later, then please leave a comment, and I'll do my best to respond to that as well. But if you're here, thanks for being here. If you're watching, thanks for watching. Please give me a like, thumbs up, and subscribe if you want to. Share if you want to. Appreciate that. Trying to be more consistent on the channel, trying to build up the community, and just trying to have fun, if I can talk right. So I'm not seeing any other questions here in the chat and the comments. That's fine. So, but again, thanks for being here. The channel is based about and really centers around classical theology, classical theism, and the role of philosophy, and trying to defend a classical philosophy, a classical theology, a classical view of apologetics, and they all kind of go together very well. And that's something unique that we do at SCS. We try to intentionally teach everything we do from a unique and systematic, intentional way that's classical, that's rooted in classical thinking. So Scott says, thanks for taking the time to interact with us. You bet. I enjoyed it. Had a lot of fun doing that. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Hope to have more of these in the future. I want to be more consistent. I want to give more videos and all that as well. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it. And we will see you guys next time. Take care.